Hi, and welcome back to Undisclosed. My name is Rabia Chaudhry. I'm an attorney and author. I'm here with my colleague, Colin Miller.
Hi, this is Colin Miller. I'm a professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law, and I blog at Evidence Prof Blog.
The launch of Serial back in 2014 sent my world into a tailspin in so many ways. I completely changed my career from national security policy and advocacy to innocence work. I became a podcaster and a published author. And I did so much public speaking that the list of universities, law schools, law firms, bar events, annual company events, conventions, conferences, fundraisers, galas, book clubs, and literary festivals where I have spoken goes on for pages. I have delivered dozens and dozens of keynotes, commencement speeches, fireside chats, and panel discussions in the past decades on a variety of subjects, but mostly about my career in civil rights advocacy, my books, and of course about criminal justice and this case. And the one question that I have gotten repeatedly, almost without fail at these many speaking events is this: how do I, as an individual, change the system? It's a question that comes from a place of deep frustration and helplessness in the face of a criminal justice system that is an absolute behemoth. A system that's broken in so many places that it feels overwhelming, impossible even to fix it. And my response to this question is always the same. If there's one single thing you can do to have the most impact on the system, one thing that's absolutely in the ability of every single person to do, it's to elect the right local prosecutor. The head of the local prosecutor's office, that district attorney or state's attorney, has more power than anyone else in the system to make broad changes in an efficient manner. That DA or SA sets the culture and priorities for his or her office. They decide if and how to charge nonviolent drug offenses. They decide how harsh or lenient to be with sentences they pursue. They investigate internal wrongdoing, or they turn a blind eye to it. They can fix the mistakes of the past, or they can dig in their heels despite new evidence showing an innocent defendant is incarcerated. In some of the cases we've covered on Undisclosed, like the Greg Lance case, where the DA fights every effort in court for that defendant to prove their innocence, even fighting DNA testing, I tell the families that their solution is no longer legal. It's political. That DA needs to be ousted and replaced with a DA who actually cares about truth and justice. Organize on the ground, I tell them. In most places, these DAs win because literally no one is running against them, or they win by slight margins of hundreds of votes, sometimes dozens. So make them pay with their elected positions and run a candidate who believes in doing the right thing. Think Larry Krasner of Philadelphia. I say this because it's the hard truth I've learned working on this case for 26 years. God almighty, the prosecutors we have had on this. Kevin Urich, Vicky Walsh, Kathleen Murphy, Thiru Vignarajah, a procession of misconduct at best and corruption at worst. And then in some cases, there's the fact that a defendant can become collateral damage between the egos and enmity between different states' attorneys' administrations, which seems to be what has happened with Adnan. Now, you all witnessed everything going on in the courts, in the media, and online, but what you didn't know is the political and personal drama behind the scenes that those of us working to exonerate Adnan were having to deal with when it came to the two prosecutors that ultimately wielded the greatest power in this case, Marilyn Mosby and Ivan Bates. In this week's episode, we're going to take you through the ups and downs, the tensions and theatrics, the politicking and propaganda, and how Adnan Syed himself became a pawn in what is an ongoing personal vendetta between these two powerful figures.
We'll start with where the politics kicked in after Serial and all the publicity that came with it. At the time, Marilyn Mosby was the Baltimore State's attorney, but this hugely popular case brought out other candidates who were hungry for the position and the spotlight as well. There were three primary contenders for this seat back in 2018 in the state's attorney's race. There was the incumbent, of course. Then there was Deputy Attorney General Thiru Vignarajah, who worked in the Maryland Attorney General's office of Brian Frosh. Adnan's PCR appeal was at the critical stage in 2016, but it wasn't being handled by State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby. Rather, the state was being represented by the Attorney General's office, specifically by Vigna.
In case you forgot, Vigna Raja was the guy who had me kicked out of Adnan's PCR hearing out of pure spite so I couldn't see Asia McClain testify. He was the dude who not only attacked Asia McClain's credibility on the stand, but also publicly slandered her at press conferences during the hearing. And he was also running to be the next Baltimore City State's attorney, and believe me when I say we were stressed out during that election. Thiru Vigna Raja used to work in the Maryland Attorney General's office, so it kind of made sense when he first was the prosecutor on the case. But then he left the Attorney General's office and he went into private practice. But the strange thing is, he continues to prosecute Adnan's case.
How unusual is that he's a private attorney as a prosecutor pro bono?
I've never heard of it. I think that what it comes down to is he did it for the publicity. When he agreed to take the case, he had already made the decision that he was going to be running for office. I think he has his eyes on greater political ambitions. It's not about the law, it's not about justice. It's about making a name for himself.
The year after the circuit court overturned Adnan's conviction in 2016, as the case was still snaking its way up the appellate courts, Vigna Raja announced his candidacy for office. The voice in the end of that last clip is Sarah Dill, an attorney and Vigna Raja's former campaign manager. According to her and others that knew Raja, his obsession with Adnan's case was tied directly to his political ambition and not much else. Those in the Free Adnan team were, of course, concerned about what would happen if Vigna won the election. Vigna had misrepresented evidence numerous times during the PCR hearing, which we covered back in Undisclosed in 2016. He fought all attempts to show how compromised Cristina Gutierrez was when she was representing Adnan, blocking admission of her medical records that would have clearly shown she was not competent during her representation. And Vigna Raja was spearheading the appeal of Adnan's conviction being overturned, determined to make the conviction stick.
Hi, everyone. Hi, we're working on a documentary about the case. We haven't been able to get any access to you. Can you tell us, why you're continuing to fight the case?
Forgive me.
You can't answer that question?
I just want to make sure we get over to court.
Well, there's just all this new evidence that shows that there are questions about the validity of the conviction. Can you just tell us why you're fighting so hard against this case getting a new trial?
If I can again, because this is a pending matter, we're going to decline to comment at this point. Thank you so much.
Is it a personal issue for you?
Thank you so much.
If Adnan ultimately won his appeal in the Maryland Supreme Court, but Vigna Raja won the election, we fully expected Vigna Raja to try Adnan again for the murder. And we expect him to play dirty. If Mosby won re-election, well, we had no idea how she might handle the case if it came back to her. She had never made a single public statement about Adnan's case. However, there was a ray of hope in all of it. And the name that ray of hope was Ivan Bates.
A city that regularly racks up more than 300 homicides a year and has a police department which has been shattered by corruption scandals, the office of the state's attorney is particularly important. Marilyn Mosby won the seat 4 years ago and is now facing a heated re-election campaign in the wake of the stunning corruption revealed by the Gun Trace Task Force trial, where a group of rogue cops were either found guilty or convicted of various robbery and racketeering charges. We're sitting down for a series of interviews with each of the candidates running for the office in the coming weeks. Marilyn Mosby, the incumbent, is best known for prosecuting the 6 officers involved in the death of Freddie Gray. With me today is one of her challengers, Ivan Bates. He's a defense attorney who defended one of those officers and spoke for all of them after Mosby dropped the charges. Before joining the defense bar, Bates served as a prosecutor in the homicide division of the state's attorney's office. In recent years, he's defended many of the victims of the Gun Trace Task Force. Welcome, Ivan.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
August 26, 2017 was the day that attorney Ivan Bates announced his candidacy for the Baltimore State's Attorney's Office. He was up against a strong incumbent, Marilyn Mosby, who had won her seat in 2014 with 94% of the vote. Ivan was on our radar well before announcing his run, thanks to his representation of Baltimore police officer Alicia White. White was one of the 6 officers Mosby had charged with the death of Freddie Gray, a case we did an extensive season on back in 2017. We were also familiar with Bates because of his representation of several victims of Baltimore's notorious Gun Trace Task Force, the entire team of which was indicted for racketeering back in 2017. Unlike Marilyn Mosby, who who is an enigma regarding Adnan's case, we knew exactly where Bates stood. Amy Burke, the director of the HBO documentary The Case Against Adnan Syed, had interviewed Bates, and he believed without reservation that Adnan deserved a new trial.
To a story we brought you as breaking news yesterday. One of the most heated races in the primary election is going on in Baltimore City. It's for the state's attorney's office.
Theo is running against two other candidates for a state's attorney. There's the incumbent, who's Marilyn Mosby, and she has not ever stated a position on Adnan's case. And then the other opponent in this race is Ivan Bates, and he publicly has stated that he doesn't think there was enough evidence to convict Adnan.
Justice has to mean that we get it right. If we get it wrong, we hurry up and fix it. And to me, this is a perfect example where they just got it wrong.
So if Ivan Bates wins, that's an exoneration for Adnan. That's not a plea deal. That's not another trial. It's not an acquittal. It's like you're done. We're done with you. But beyond that, he said he would reopen the investigation. That means all those leads that nobody followed up on, all that evidence that might still exist somewhere, like we could actually find out who killed Heyman Lee. It's a big deal.
I have no recollection of how I first became personally acquainted with Ivan Bates, but I dug back into my emails, and the earliest mention I can find of him is an email from December of 2016, written to me by investigative journalist Justine Barron. You might remember Justine, who, along with Amelia McDonald Perry, investigated and reported on our seasons of the Freddie Gray and Keith Davis Jr. cases. This email exchange was about their upcoming Freddie Gray season and whether they should contact Ivan. And then clearly at some point he and I connected directly, both online and in person. And the more I got to know Ivan, the more impressed I became. He was a veteran, serving honorably in the U.S. Army before law school. It was initially a little troubling to me that Ivan's legal career began in the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office from 1996 to 2002, the same time period in which Adnan was arrested and prosecuted. In fact, he even remembered the case and being in the courtroom during Adnan's bail hearing. But then, Ivan left the prosecutor's office and went on to become a defense attorney, eventually starting his own practice. I liked that he understood the forces at play on both sides of a criminal prosecution, and I believed that it made him principled and disciplined. He believed in justice, not just for Adnan, but for Keith Davis Jr., for whom he did some pro bono work and public advocacy. I met up with Ivan for lunch a couple of times to size him up and found him to be smart, earnest, affable, and genuine. I trusted my gut, and I decided I have to help this man win the state's attorney's race, and Ivan was down for all the help he could get. I had a bit of experience with the media and public relations at that point, of course, and I was already a published author. So I had a plan for Ivan, and that plan was that he needed to write a book that would launch him into the national spotlight as the most important voice on criminal justice reform. I offered to help him find a ghostwriter. I gave him feedback on his website. I gave him feedback on his Baltimore Plan political platform. I connected him to activists and advocates and folks in the media. I helped organize public events for him. We communicated constantly, and the communication went both ways. He fed me a steady stream of intel and gossip about Thiru Vignaraja, the man we both detested, the candidate that had to be defeated at all costs. And I, in turn, sent that information to media sources, other advocates, and posted about it on Twitter and Facebook. And then, as the election approached, Bates gave the Rolling Stone magazine an incredible interview. The byline of the article read, "Democratic challenger Ivan Bates tells Rolling Stone that, if elected, he would drop the charges against serial subject Adnan Syed." That came as a shock to Team Adnan. This was more than Bates saying that Adnan deserved a new trial. This was him saying he would completely exonerate Adnan. My behind-the-scenes work for Ivan ratcheted up. I really didn't pay much attention to Mosby at the time. To be honest, my sights were on taking down Thiru. And as I said before, Mosby hadn't publicly said anything about Adnan's case, and I wasn't willing to risk making her angry. It was a delicate balance with Mosby because Undisclosed did do a season on Freddie Gray and the mishandling of the prosecutions by Mosby's office. We also did a season about Keith Davis Jr. and how he was so clearly framed, and we believed his ongoing prosecution was unconscionable. Colin even went so far as co-authoring a motion that was filed in court alleging vindictive prosecution of Keith Davis Jr. And while I had produced the Keith Davis Jr. season, I wasn't about to make things personal with Mosby. I saw how that went because Keith's wife, Kelly Davis, attacked Mosby in person and online for years, and I was pretty sure that had a lot to do with Mosby tripling down on the case and prosecuting Keith over and over. I was an advocate for Adnan, but I wasn't an idiot. Sadly, the bar being low, Mosby was still also more progressive than any other prosecutor who ever touched Adnan's case, and then there was the fact that in 2015, she had established the first CIU in Maryland, a conviction integrity unit.
In case you're not familiar with conviction integrity units, they're exactly what the name sounds like. Specialized departments within a prosecutor's office that accept applications and petitions from defendants that say they've been wrongfully convicted by that very jurisdiction. The first such known unit was formed back in 2004 in Santa Ana, California, but it didn't last long before being disbanded. Then in 2007, the Dallas County, Texas DA's office established a CIU after the county had experienced a record number of exonerations. That CIU became a model and inspired the creation of others, and today there are roughly 115 conviction integrity units in both county and state levels around the country. They don't all operate in the same way, because they don't have the same mandates, resources, or methodology. So it's fair to say that results vary. In fact, about half of CIUs haven't produced a single exoneration in all their years of operation. But by the time of the 2018 Baltimore City State's Attorney's election, Mosby's CIU had already exonerated 3 innocent men. It seemed like a reasonable expectation that if Adnan filed a case with his CIU one day, he might be given a fighting chance. Adnan's best bets in the election, therefore, were Ivan Bates and Marilyn Mosby. But again, there was no guarantee how Mosby would deal with the case if given the chance. Polls showed that Thiero wasn't exactly a threat to Mosby, but it seemed like he could prove to be a spoiler for Bates. Now, if you've seen the HBO documentary, you know that on June 27, 2018, Marilyn Mosby swept that primary with 49.4% of the vote, Ivan Bates came in second with 28.1%, and Thiero ranked third with 22.5% of the vote. All three had been running as Democrats, and because no Republican was running in opposition, Mosby had essentially won her second term. If you've watched the HBO documentary, you can see the reaction of Team Adnan as they followed the results on election night. It was disappointing that Bates, a public advocate for Adnan, had lost, and given that Mosby was firmly going to remain the state's attorney, we had to hope for the best from the appellate courts. That's because Thiero Vignoraja continued to propel the case up the appellate chain. After the circuit court's decision to grant Adnan a new trial was affirmed by the Intermediate Appellate Court of Maryland, Vignoraja then appealed to the highest court in the state. Still, things were looking good for Adnan. After all, 2 courts had agreed his conviction needed to be tossed, which is likely why the Attorney General's office offered Adnan a plea deal in the spring of 2019. The terms of the deal were this. Adnan had to plead guilty, serve 4 more years in prison, and then he could be released. It was, by all means, an egregious offer, especially given that A.G. Brian Frosch had run DNA tests on 14 pieces of evidence before making the offer, and Adnan's DNA was nowhere to be found. Adnan refused the plea deal, as most people know, but then this happened.
Conviction reinstated in a close ruling. Maryland's highest court decides Adnan Syed will not get a new trial. What this latest decision means for the convicted killer going forward. Hello, everybody. I'm Mary Bubala. In a split 4-3 decision, the Maryland Court of Appeals denies a new trial for Adnan Syed. He gained national attention after his case was the subject of the popular podcast Serial. And WJZ is live outside Circuit Court right now. Paul Gessler reports on why Maryland's highest court rejected the new trial. Paul?
Good evening, Maria. The last time most of us saw Adnan Syed was 2016. He was walking out of this door at Circuit Court behind these bars. He had just been granted a new trial. Well, it appears now after this ruling from the Maryland Court of Appeals, there will not be a new trial after a ruling today. Adnan Syed will remain in prison following Friday's opinion from the state's highest court. The Maryland Court of Appeals voted to reinstate Syed's conviction. Syed was convicted in 2000 in the murder of his high school ex-girlfriend, Hae Min Lee. He is serving a life sentence in her murder, but his case was highlighted in 2014 in the podcast Serial, raising concerns about cell phone tower data and an alibi witness never called to testify.
did such me.
Syed's attorneys hoped his alibi, Woodlawn High School classmate Asia McClain, could spark a new trial. She says she saw Syed in the library the day of the murder, which conflicts with the state's timeline. The Court of Appeals acknowledged Friday Syed's counsel was deficient, but that Syed had waived his claim of ineffectual counsel.
You acknowledge the fact that it wasn't done by the book and that she was wrong for not contacting me, but then to say that you don't think it would make a difference makes no sense. It makes no sense to me.
Adnan's attorney, Justin Brown, tweeted he spoke with Syed late Friday night, and they won't give up on the case.
Mr. Syed's witness will likely never get to testify on his behalf, and that's really a shame.
Legal expert Brandon Mead says the court did not think McClain's testimony would have changed the guilty outcome.
It's almost looking into a crystal ball to see what the outcome would have been had that witness been interviewed and been presented.
Assistant Attorney General Tharu Vignarajah said in a statement Friday, Syed's conviction was just and supported by overwhelming evidence. He went on to say they hope the decision brings a degree of closure for the Lee family. Back live now here in downtown Baltimore. Today's ruling comes just days before an HBO docuseries titled The Case Against Adnan Syed. It is scheduled to be released Sunday. Reporting live downtown outside Circuit Court, Paul Gallagher.
If there was ever a time I wanted to walk away from this case, this was it. I was in the deepest, darkest hole I had been in years. I've been fighting to keep my marriage together and fighting to free Adnan, and in that moment, I wanted to literally walk away from all of it. I was in Austin, Texas at the time at a marriage retreat when my phone began lighting up with condolences about the court's decision. I got up from the lunch table where we were eating with other couples, walked to my room, and refused to get out of bed. It took 2 of the counselors sitting with me for the rest of the day for me to finally get up. But I was done with the retreat and headed home earlier than planned because that weekend I still had to prepare for dozens of friends coming over for a watch party. The ruling came 2 days before the premiere of the HBO documentary and, of course, took all the excitement out of it. Of course, none of that mattered in the face of the devastation that Adnan and his family were going through. I couldn't bring myself to see or speak to Adnan for weeks. What could I say now that our best chance was gone? We had been so close to freedom that we'd been planning where he would live and what re-entry would look like when he got home that year. When I finally visited Adnan in prison weeks after the decision, it was the first time I had ever seen him cry. Now, I was there in the courtroom the day that Adnan was convicted. He didn't cry. He turned to all of us to reassure us. The day he was sentenced, he didn't cry. He once again consoled all his loved ones who were crying. He had lost appeal after appeal, and I hadn't seen him cry. But this time he wept, and he asked me the question, was he wrong to have turned down Frosh's plea deal? Did he make a mistake? Should he have taken the deal and accepted guilt even though he wasn't guilty? His despair in that moment drove me to say something I regretted the minute I left the prison. I said, Adnan, you did the right thing. Frosh wanted you to serve 4 more years. You give me those 4 years. We will find another way to have you home in those 4 years. I said that, and I left, and I had no idea what we were going to do next, much less in 4 years. We didn't have Ivan in office, and we had litigated and lost on the strongest issue I felt we had, Asia McClain's alibi. What I didn't know at the time was that another force was about to enter Adnan's life and begin turning the wheels that would eventually get him home. Hey, Undisclosed listeners, we're going to take a quick ad break, and I just want to explain something to you about why it's so important for you guys to support our sponsors. You might not know this, but all these years, all the work we have done for all of the defendants whose cases we reinvestigate and cover has been pro bono. We don't charge them or their families or their lawyers a dime. And the only way we can afford to do this, which this is work that would ordinarily cost a defendant hundreds of thousands of dollars, the only way we can afford to do this is because of our sponsors. So we are so grateful to our sponsors, and we are grateful to all of you. If you want to know what you can do to help support our work, support our sponsors. Thank you so much. You remember summertime as a kid, the freedom of nature, opportunities born from freedom, rites of passage like riding a bike, setting up a lemonade stand, and even learning to earn and manage a buck. Now, with school out, summer is a perfect time to teach your kids real-world money skills that they can use forever.
Greenlight is a debit card company and money app that's made for families that helps kids to learn how to save, invest, and spend wisely. Parents can send money to their kids and keep an eye on how they're spending and saving. Meanwhile, those kids and teens can build money confidence and skills in a fun and accessible way that feels more like a game than a lesson.
The Greenlight app also includes a chores feature where you can set up one-time or recurring chores customized to your household and reward kids with an allowance for a job well done. And I cannot tell you how amazing this has been for me as the summer has just begun to keep my 16-year-old and my 8-year-old in line. First of all, they get to earn some money. Second of all, you have no idea how excited an 8-year-old can be with a debit card in their hand. And that's what the Greenlight card is. It's a little debit card for him, and he gets to earn money on that by doing his chores. Greenlight is so easy. It's a convenient way for parents to raise financially smart kids and families to navigate their life together.
Maybe that's the reason why millions of parents trust and kids love learning about money on Greenlight, the #1 family finance and safety app.
So don't wait to teach your kids real-world money skills. Start your risk-free Greenlight trial today at greenlight.com/towardjustice. That's greenlight.com/towardjustice to get started. greenlight.com/towardjustice. It was sometime in the fall of 2019, 6 months or so after Adnan's conviction had been reinstated and the documentary aired, that Adnan told me he wanted me to meet someone, a woman that he'd been talking to. She was going to come to a forum we were organizing about his case, and even though she knew me from a distance, she was nervous to meet me. I wasn't nervous to meet her, but I was weary. Over the years since Serial, I have lost track of the dozens of women that have reached out to me, declaring Adnan to be the love of their life and begging me to introduce them to him. That, I told them, was not my place. I wasn't a matchmaker, and for God's sake, they couldn't all be his soulmate. I have a faint idea of how many women wrote to him in prison, sending letters and pictures that he politely put aside but didn't respond to. This time was different, apparently. This woman, who I'm not going to name, had never heard Serial, but she had come across a documentary one night and decided to write to Adnan, offering prayers and moral support. He was in the lowest place he had been in years, and unlike the hundreds of other letters he didn't respond to, this time he wrote back. They struck up a deep friendship that quickly turned into love, and now he wanted me to meet her. So I did, with some reservations, but all those reservations melted away nearly immediately. She was so kind, down to earth, smart, sweet, and full of faith that the next time I spoke to Adnan, I told him how lucky he was to have met her. And I was lucky too, because she helped forge the next path forward in the case. What we needed to do, she said, was get the JRA passed in Maryland.
There's only one nation in the entire world that continues to sentence offenders under the age of 18 to life without the possibility of parole. Obviously, that nation is the United States. But since 2005, the Supreme Court has issued rulings in 5 cases which stand for the proposition that, quote, children are constitutionally different from adults in their levels of culpability. According to the Sentencing Project, quote, research in adolescent brain development confirms the common sense understanding that children are different from adults in ways that are critical to identifying age-appropriate criminal sentences. This understanding, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy called it what any parent knows, was central to the recent Supreme Court decisions excluding people under 18 from the harshest sentencing practices. Starting in 2005, Roper v. Simmons struck down the death penalty for people under the age of 18. Then, in 2010, Graham v. Florida invalidated life without parole sentences for people under 18 convicted of non-homicide offenses. 2 years later, in Miller v. Alabama, the court recognized the need to protect nearly all youth from life without parole sentences, regardless of the crime of conviction. Life without parole, as a mandatory minimum sentence for anyone under the age of 18, was found to be unconstitutional. Montgomery v. Louisiana in 2016 clarified that Miller applied retroactively. Jones v. Mississippi reaffirmed both Montgomery and Miller, but held that a specific factual finding of, quote, permanent incorrigibility at the time of sentencing is not required for the imposition of a juvenile life without parole sentence. The Miller v. Alabama ruling banning life without the possibility of parole sentences for juvenile offenders happened in 2012. 4 years later, in 2016, Montgomery v. Alabama made the Miller ruling retroactive, meaning it would apply to Adnan's case. And yet, there was no direct mechanism in Maryland to apply the Supreme Court's ruling to juvenile lifers. That is how and why the JRA, or the Juvenile Restoration Act of Maryland, was born.
In the months leading up to the JRA bill being introduced in the Maryland House of Delegates, Adnan's wife led a team of volunteers in organizing and lobbying for the passage of the bill. Yes, I said wife because by that time Adnan and his soulmate had gotten married in a religious ceremony. This team was incredible. They came up with talking points, prepared witnesses to testify, organized a social media strategy, developed petitions, created digital media. You name it, they were on it. I did my part by tweet shaming every legislator that mattered and called in favors from every public personality and celebrity that I knew to be part of the media strategy.
The advocacy and the lobbying worked. In March of 2021, the JRA was passed in the Maryland House of Delegates, and the following month, it passed in the Senate. The governor at the time, Larry Hogan, vetoed the bill when it landed on his desk, but then 2 days later, the Maryland General Assembly overrode that veto and passed the bill into law on April 10th, 2021, with it going into effect on October 1st, 2021. This new law effectuated the Supreme Court's ruling in Miller v. Alabama from nearly a decade earlier and gave 415 juvenile lifers in Maryland a chance at being resentenced. It also prompted the Office of the Public Defender of Maryland to launch the Decarceration Initiative, which would provide free representation to those eligible under the JRA to petition for relief. This initiative and the new law applied squarely to Adnan's case, and so Adnan's attorney, Erica Suter, who worked for the Office of the Public Defender, approached Marilyn Mosby's office with a JRA petition for Adnan. Now, a lot else was happening around Mosby at the time. She was again running for re-election against those same two candidates as she did previously, Ivan Bates and Theodore Ignaraja. This time, though, the landscape looked very, very different for Mosby. Between 2020 and 2021, she had federal tax liens filed against her, was facing an investigation by the Office of the Inspector General about unreported travel and speaking engagements, questions about using LLCs owned by her for write-offs, and was charged with inappropriate use of campaign funds. It seemed as if the walls were closing in on Mosby. She obviously had no friends in law enforcement after having charged 6 police officers in the killing of Freddie Gray, and had made fierce enemies with local social justice activists, thanks in large part to her continued prosecution of Keith Davis Jr. Then, of course, there were political enemies, the 2 men vying for her office, and apparently many, many others in the state of Maryland that Mosby had rubbed the wrong way. It's hard to know exactly what it was that led to what came next, a federal indictment.
Do the elephant in the room. Let's talk about the charges. What you're accused of, when you buy a home, you can take money out of your 401k. Yep. There are strict rules as to when you can do it to take money out early. You are accused of taking money out of your 401k early to buy homes and not being honest about why. Using the CARES Act, which benefits people who are having financial issues, and then using sort of incorrect information about liens, not disclosing them, and using that to get loans. That's sort of just the summary of what you're accused of.
So
how do you respond
let me
to
just
that?
be clear, and I'll defer to my attorney on the specifics. Mm-hmm. But this has been a long-term investigation that has gone through every aspect of my life. From my charitable donations to my tax returns. They have interviewed every political donator. They have gone to my hairdresser, my children's dance instructors. And this is ultimately, they sent subpoenas to black churches throughout the city of Baltimore. In an election year, I'm 4 months from my election, right? And this is what they come back with. Me accessing my own personal funds that I put away every single week. And so, at the end of the day, and again, I'll defer to my attorney, there's ulterior motives for something like this, for an attack like this. But this is more so about the fact that he wasn't able to do what he did in his donations, which was to support my opponents. And he's using this indictment 4 months before my election to have this cloud of aspersion over my head.
That clip came from the Joy Ann Reid show, and the he that Mosby is referring to is Leo Wise, the federal prosecutor leading the investigation against her, a prosecutor who had already donated to her political opponents. Wise is a well-known quantity in the world of Baltimore anti-corruption investigations, and in fact was responsible for bringing down the gun trace task force. We mentioned that earlier in this episode, that same police task force that victimized and extorted Baltimore residents, some of those victims having been represented by Ivan Bates. Wise came to this job with a troubling past. He had been forced to resign after 2 years from his position as chief counsel with the Office of Congressional Ethics amidst charges of racial and political profiling. According to an article in Slate written by Justine Barron, yes, the same Justine Barron that worked on our Freddie Gray and Keith Davis Jr. seasons, quote, at one point he, Wise, had 8 open investigations, all of them targeting black Democratic members of the House. He was also criticized for selecting investigations on a whim, letting investigations become public news, sometimes before elections, and digging into personal finances. The Congressional Black Caucus drafted a resolution to limit Wise's discretion. Wise was then assigned to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland, where his track record didn't seem to get any better. Again, from Justine Barron's article. Quote, in 2020, Wise took over as chief of the Fraud and Public Corruption Unit in Maryland. There was one major red flag in Wise's Baltimore portfolio, though. His targets continued to be almost all black. Shortly after he took office, he indicted Police Commissioner Darrell D'Souza, a black man, for failure to pay taxes. He did not indict the white police commanders who oversaw the gun trace task force, one of whom was named in court as a conspirator. He indicted and convicted Kenneth Ravenel, a prominent black attorney, for money laundering. He then indicted Ravenel's own attorney and defense investigator for obstruction of justice. Mosby was Wise's last major corruption target in Baltimore. A year before her indictment in March 2021, Wise's office made it known to the press that Mosby and her husband, Nick Mosby, the city council president, were under investigation. Now, in the background of all of these investigations against Mosby was the fact that her office had Adnan's JRA petition in their hands. And also by this time, Mosby's CIU unit had exonerated an additional 9 innocent defendants, bringing her total exonerations to 12 men. The men had served between 14 and 36 years for crimes they had not committed. As Adnan's petition was being considered by Mosby's team for resentencing under the JRA, it caught the attention of her team as a possible wrongful conviction instead. When Erica first told me the news that Mosby's very prolific CIU was investigating whether Adnan was wrongfully convicted versus just considering resentencing him under the JRA, I was, of course, ecstatic. I had no idea what the investigation entailed, who was involved, what issues they were considering. Nothing. I just had to wait like everyone else to see what they concluded. But in the meantime, the election was looming large and the pressure was on. It seemed clear that given the charges that Mosby was facing and the polls, she was not going to win re-election. I had remained friendly with Ivan since his last bid and encouraged him along his journey for political office, convinced that he would be one of the good guys if he won. After all, here's what he said back in 2018.
In his 2018 concession speech, Fox 45 News has a recording of
individuals in this city on the
Bates laying out his 4 big priorities.
Free Keith Davis now. Stop the prosecution of Adnan Syed. Carl Weston promised them 4 years ago that you would open that case. I demand you reopen that case and stop prosecuting marijuana possession.
But of course, I couldn't publicly support either candidate. Not the one who could possibly exonerate Adnan at that moment, Mosby, or the one that could exonerate him in the future, Ivan Bates. All I could do was continue to give Thiru Vignarajah public thrashings online, which I was happy to do, and wait for the end of the CIU's investigation. And also, of course, see how the federal case against Mosby was going to go, and how all of this was going to play out in the election.
And so I get it. Like, I have done things as a prosecutor that a lot of other prosecutors have not done in this country, whether that is holding police accountable when a lot of other prosecutors in this country would not do so, whether that is ending the war on drugs, which we know was a war on black people in the city of Baltimore, whether that is exonerating 12 innocent black men who the criminal justice system was willing and able to allow to rot for 300 years in jail for crimes they did not commit. Right? I've done things that would upset the status quo, but to understand and to recognize all that they've attempted to do. I've been mocked, I've been ridiculed, I've gotten hate mail, I've gotten death threats, I've gotten it all. I've gotten lawsuits. OIG investigations, state ethics investigations. They've been coming for my law license since I charged those officers in Freddie Gray. They literally kept an open and pending investigation against me for 3 years. And so I get it. But at the end of the day, what I hope most people in the city of Baltimore understand and recognize is that this is more about my election than anything else.
Well, if it was about the election, it worked. On July 19th, 2022, Ivan Bates swept the primary election with 40.9% of the vote. Thera Vignaraja made a strong showing with 30.29% of the vote, and Mosby came in third with 28.8% of the vote. Now, on a side note, the total number of voters that voted in the election was only 84,784. Mosby trailed Bates by only about 10,000 votes. If you think about it, that's not that many votes in a city with a population of well over 500,000 residents. Imagine then how small the margins are in smaller jurisdictions and just how doable it is to get the right person elected into office. Back to the election. Mosby now had until the end of her term to finish her investigation in Adnan's case, but it wasn't until mid-September that we heard any news. Just days before it happened, we learned that Marilyn Mosby was going to file a motion to vacate Adnan's conviction based upon Brady violations that her office's investigation had uncovered. The hearing on the motion took place on September 19th, 2022, and that same day, Adnan walked out of a court a free man. Not long after, having gotten DNA testing results that excluded Adnan as a source of a DNA mixture found in Hayes' shoes, Mosby dropped all charges against Adnan. We've already recapped all that happened since that time in episode 1 of this series, so we won't go through all that again. We'll instead pick up from when the Maryland Supreme Court upheld the Lee family's appeal in August of last year based upon lack of notice for the hearing and sent the case all the way back down to the circuit court to hold a brand new hearing on the motion to vacate Adnan's convictions. Remember, that was the motion that Mosby filed in September of 22, but Mosby was no longer the state's attorney. Ivan Bates had been the state's attorney since January 1st, 2023, and no one had any idea how he'd handle the motion if it came all the way back down and he was faced with it. Would Bates defend the motion? Would he withdraw it? If he withdrew it, would Adnan then have to go back to prison after 2 years of freedom? This was no time to take any chances, so Adnan's attorney, Erica Suter, did what she had set out to do 3 years earlier when she initially approached Mosby's office about a Juvenile Restoration Act petition. On December 30th, 2024, Suter filed the JRA petition for Adnan, just in case Bates made a left turn with a motion to vacate.
On February 23rd, 2025, Ivan Bates tweeted the following. The hearing on the Juvenile Restoration Act for Adnan Syed is scheduled this Wednesday, February 26th. Check back this week on the filing of my office's response to the vacator motion. In his tweet, Bates tagged HBO and the podcast Serial. Make of that what you will. For the record, I hadn't communicated with Ivan since March of 2023. We had texted a handful of times since the election. I congratulated him, genuinely happy that he beat Thera, and knowing well that Mosby had little to no chance to win. On September 19th, 2022, Ivan texted me to congratulate me on Adnan's release. I thanked him for his support all these years. He responded, "You're welcome. So happy." I told him I wanted to have him over for dinner with Adnan and Amy Berg and the defense team, and he said he would like it very much. He again congratulated me on October 12th, 2022, when Mosby dropped the charges against Adnan, and I told him that I couldn't wait until he met Adnan one day. He said he would really like it, and then told me that a friend of his at Coppin State University would like Adnan to attend school there. I said, sure, connect us. In January of 2023, I congratulated him on exonerating Keith Davis Jr. and again congratulated him in March of 2023 for the release of the film I Got a Monster, which featured Ivan's work on the Gun Trace Task Force case. After that, we exchanged a few texts about getting together for lunch, but it never happened. And then once it became clear that his office would have to deal with the motion to vacate, I knew better than to stay in touch, and probably he did too. So we didn't know where Ivan stood on the motion. But we found out on February 25th, 2025, when he filed an 88-page memorandum in support of withdrawing the motion to vacate. It wasn't a simple withdrawal in light of the fact that there was a JRA petition pending. It was an absolute indictment of Mosby and her legal team, specifically the chief of her sentencing unit, Becky Feldman, and the investigation they did leading up to the 2022 motion to vacate and the actual exoneration of Adnan. I could not stomach reading the motion because I was so disgusted with the fact that for years, Ivan had gone on the record saying Adnan deserved a new trial, that he was wrongfully convicted, even that there was no evidence against him. For example, in that 2018 Rolling Stone interview where Ivan said he would drop charges against Adnan if elected, he also said this, quote, "The evidence the state had is non-existent. The star witness is absolutely terrible and has a number of credibility issues. And the witness the defense has, who wasn't at the original trial, doesn't have those same issues and is very believable." And now, here he was, with the power to drop charges against Adnan, and yet he refused to even give him a chance at a new trial. Then he was doing media in which he took a position so disingenuous, it still makes my head spin.
So I'm going to ask you the question you've probably gotten sick of hearing, which is, as a private citizen, you had taken a position on Adnan that maybe, his conviction should be vacated and maybe he did deserve a new trial, et cetera, et cetera. And then as state's attorney, obviously after an investigation, you moved to withdraw the vacatur of his conviction. So what changed?
Well, a couple things changed. One, when I made that statement, it was right after Judge Welch had ruled that there was ineffective assistance of counsel. So I had a peak in terms of what the record said. Then you had the appeals, and you had what then was the Maryland Court of Special Appeals, which is now a Supreme Court, issue, I think it was 100 and some odd page ruling. Once you read that ruling, it kind of opens your eyes a little bit. But once I got into the seat and we go through the transcripts and you read things, look, Christina Gutierrez was his lawyer. Christina Gutierrez, when I was a young prosecutor, you were like, oh God, I hope to God she doesn't take this case. She was that phenomenal of a lawyer. And then you also have the opportunity to talk to Kevin Urick. Look, I was in the state's attorney's office when Adnan case came through. I remember sitting in the courtroom when he had the bail review, where half the courtroom was the Muslim community, half the courtroom was the Asian community. The judge I clerked for was David Mitchell, who did the bail review hearing. So I remember that. But I also remember things that Kevin Urick said that registered with me. We had an open file policy where our state's attorney, Mrs. Jesme, said, look, especially homicide, Don Giblin was one of the heads of homicide. Just tell them to come look at your file. And if it's in there, who cares? Because we're going to win anyway. That's before body camera and everything else. So things like that made sense to me. Once I began to look at that, once I began to look at the transcript, Wanda Hurd, who was the judge, she was a good friend. She retired and she did a lot with me in terms of my campaign. And we would talk about the case. Read the transcript. It's there in the transcript. Well, guess what? You got to read the transcript.
The transcripts, the trial transcript, Ivan, the transcript that's been available online for a decade, the transcript of a trial in which the only evidence the state has, as you yourself pointed out repeatedly, was a witness that lacked any credibility, a witness whose own testimony destroyed the state's timeline. Since you clearly didn't read the trial transcripts, Ivan, Jay testified at 2 different trials that on the day that Hae-Min Lee disappeared, he was at his friend Jennifer Pusateri's house till almost 3:45 p.m., while at the same time the state was making the case that Adnan made a call to Jay at 2:36 p.m. saying, hey, I killed Hae-Min Lee, come get me. And as for Gutierrez, Ivan and I had spoken numerous times in the past about how compromised she was in her last few years. There was a reason Thiru Vignarajah fought to exclude her medical records from the PCR hearing. The records would have shown how sick and incompetent she was when she was representing Adnan. And Ivan knows it. He told me himself he knows that she failed Adnan.
None of what Ivan has been telling the media seems to be the real reason that he withdrew the motion to vacate. There's nothing in the trial transcripts that has anything to do with the Brady evidence that vacated Adnan's conviction or the DNA testing that excluded Adnan as a contributor. It seems the real reason he withdrew the motion is that he's out to undo and undermine Marilyn Mosby's work. This isn't about Adnan. This is about a personal vendetta that Ivan Bates has against Mosby. He's so committed to destroying her that he's even made the unprecedented move of filing an Attorney Grievance Commission complaint against her and her chief, Becky Feldman, for the work in Adnan's case.
He's the person who has come in after me. I will just say Ivan Bates, who's the newly elected state's attorney, has used this opportunity to try to hurt me. He filed an attorney grievance against me on one particular case. Despite the thousands of cases that I oversaw that I didn't personally investigate, really a shucking and jiving, we got those folks that tap dance and hold the water for the status quo. And that's essentially what's being done. I now have to fight an additional battle, which is to defend myself in the Adnan Syed case, which I believe I was right in making that determination. He has challenged my discretion, and it has made an unprecedented move to file an attorney grievance against me and the attorney who actually investigated the case. And so we are both, again, battling again on the front to try to keep my law license in defense of that case.
Because you brought up the Syed case, one, your successor, Ivan Bates, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on why he's so focused on you. Secondly, if you would, just for the benefit of our audience, give a little background on what the Syed case is and what the issue is since you brought it up.
So Adnan Syed was another one. I created the first conviction integrity unit in the entire state of Maryland, where we did reinvestigations into claims of actual innocence. I also had a sentencing review unit where we modified and reduced the sentences of juvenile lifers in the elderly prison population, where we released more than 60 individuals by modifying their sentence. I had an individual attorney that actually was a senior attorney at the public defender's office, Becky Feldman, who came over and worked my sentencing review unit. And under her leadership, she actually reviewed the Adnan Syed case. This is a case that dates very far back, where he was wrongly, we believe after a thorough investigation, that he was wrongly convicted of murder. And so we did our due diligence. We investigated the case and ultimately made a recommendation to vacate the conviction of Adnan Syed, and rightfully so, we would argue. As you are aware, prosecutors, we exercise our discretion every single day, right? In thousands of cases. And this particular case is a high-profile case. It's rather controversial, but when you are elected into these positions and as a leader, you have to make a decision, right? You stand on the moral beliefs of what you're doing is right, and that's what we did.
That was Marilyn Mosby being interviewed in the Native Land podcast recently. Mosby was, by the way, eventually convicted of perjury and mortgage fraud and sentenced to 12 months of home confinement rather than prison. She has an ongoing appeal, and thus far her law license has not been suspended. So why is Bates going after her? Is he scratching the back of the Baltimore police, which has had it out for Mosby since Freddie Gray? Is it to appease Judge Wanda Hurd, Adnan's trial judge, who's a good friend of Bates and publicly endorsed him? Sources have told us that Bates asked Judge Hurd not to oppose Adnan's JRI petition. Was that in exchange for upholding the conviction? Or is it possible that Bates still sees Mosby as a threat to his position? After all, despite all the charges that Mosby was facing, she still did have an incredible amount of support from the public and even from organizations like the NAACP.
It was thanks to you. We had a national campaign and, organizations signed on, Black Win with Black Women and, the Congressional Black Caucus and 60 attorneys and Ben Crump. And, it started with you.
Over 100,000 people, right?
100,000 people signed that petition.
Whatever it is that motivated Bates to withdraw the motion, it's unlikely it was the actual merits of Adnan's case.
Unfortunately, I think that the newly elected state's attorney is playing politics, just like Trump, right? And unfortunately, he took advantage of the fact that I had this bogus investigation and looming criminal case hanging over me. He had run against me before and lost, but this time around he won. And he ran on a platform of pretty much reversing everything that I had done in my office, progressive related. And he did just that. So now when you ask, why would someone do something like that? Well, he was, the
Fox 45, who's a local sort of Fox station, put $200,000 into my race to support him, right? And so why would he do that? He carries the weight of the status quo.
On March 6th of this year, Adnan was resentenced to time served pursuant to the Juvenile Restoration Act.
Is the Adnan Syed case over?
You know, he was placed on 5 years period of probation, and he still has the ability to file a writ of error in coram nobis. It's upon him if he wants to. However, if he files that, then he is the moving party. Every aspect within the criminal justice system that which he's been the moving party, he has not been successful.
Except that Adnan was successful with the JRA. In 2019, I promised Adnan that if he gave me 4 years, the 4 years that Brian Frosch wanted him to yet serve in prison, I'd help him get out. 3 years later, in 2022, Adnan was released from prison thanks to a bid for him to be resentenced under the JRA. I will never stop being amazed at this sequence of events that has led us here. Think about it. Adnan's conviction had to be reinstated in 2019 in order for his wife to come into his life. And it took the ceaseless efforts of his wife to get the JRA passed, which ultimately ended up not only giving Adnan his permanent freedom, but also giving that freedom to dozens of others. Did Adnan do the right thing by rejecting Brian Frosch's plea offer? Unquestionably. In the years since Adnan's release, he has worked steadily for Georgetown University's Prison Justice Initiative. He was by my father's side when my father passed away, and Adnan was by his own father's side when he passed away as well. He is happily married and planning for a future so many people fought to deprive him of. He may be living as a convicted felon, but it doesn't mean he still can't be exonerated.
If he brings us a smoking gun that we've never seen, that totally shows that he's innocent, of course, we would definitely look at that. We would definitely take that in consideration, and we would do the right thing.
In that case, Ivan Bates, I hope you listen to our podcast. It is one smoking gun, one steady stream of innocence evidence, one Brady violation after another. But if you don't listen to it, there might be another state's attorney that does. You're here today, but could be gone tomorrow. That's politics, right?
You know, I make mistakes. Now, people are going to be mad. It is what it is. When you become a politician, you're not going to please everybody. But at the end of the day, if I lose this job because I did the right thing, I'm okay with that.
Challenge accepted, Mr. State's Attorney. But I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope you remember your promise that if Adnan comes back with a smoking gun proving his innocence, you will indeed take it seriously. Because we now have a new statement from a witness that proves Adnan could not have killed Heyman Lee. Next time on Undisclosed.
Hey guys, it's Mithil, executive producer of Undisclosed Toward Justice. Want to give a quick shout out to Hannah McCarthy for audio production and Animal Weapon for our theme music. This time around, we're doing something different. You can leave us questions, comments, thoughts, and suggestions in a voice note, and we might even play it on air. Just go to speakpipe.com/undisclosed and start recording. For those of you that want to engage on social media, you can follow, share, and like us on all the different platforms. We're on Instagram and Facebook at Undisclosed Podcast. For folks on X, we're still at Undisclosed Pod. Also, please go to subscribe to our new YouTube channel at Undisclosed Pod so you don't miss out on any content there. Whether you're a new or returning listener, you can check out our previous cases and bonus episodes by going to our revamped website at undisclosedpod.com. If you want to follow Colin and Rabia on social media as well, you can find Rabia at Rabia2 on Instagram, and Colin is at Evidence Prof on Instagram and Blue Sky. Thanks for your continued support for us and for our sponsors. Until next time.